So it's not often that you see what appears to be a telescope manufacturer dissing their own telescope on their own product page. But that seems to be what is happening with the William Optics Minicat 51. And in this video, I want to have a closer look at what is going on here. And we'll also take the opportunity to compare spot diagrams and to learn how to read spot diagrams, because they can be very useful tools to compare from one telescope to another. And they're very often overlooked. So we'll keep things educational in this video as well. By the way, I'm Quiv and welcome back to the channel. I also want to thank Luke from the amazing Lucomatico channel who first made a video on this topic. I'll put the link to that video up above and down in the description so you can have a look at his own point of view on this situation. Okay, so the telescope in question, as I was mentioning, is the Minicat 51 WIFD. And if you're familiar with astrophotography, or you've done astrophotography in the past, you have very likely heard or used its larger brother, the Redcat 51, which is an extremely popular telescope in the hobby that has an aperture, a lens diameter of 51 millimeters and a focal ratio of f4.9 effectively. And that thing has been extremely popular. The Minicat 51 seems to be a variation on that same design. It has the same 51mm aperture, but it has now a faster focal ratio of f3.5. It also retains one of the defining features of the Redcat 51 in that it is a Petzval design, which means that effectively you do not have to care about something that is called back focus, and it's something that always make things difficult for beginners in the hobby. So not having to care about it is really good. Back focus, by the way, is if you look at the telescope from the side, you can see you have the very back end of the telescope. And for most telescopes, you need the distance between that back end and your camera sensor to be exactly 55 millimeters. That can be difficult to achieve in some cases. The Redcat series, because of their Petzval design, they don't care about that. As long as you manage to reach focus, the distance between the back end and the telescope and your camera sensor doesn't matter. It makes a lot of things much simpler. So on the face of it, we have like this smaller, tinier, cuter, faster version of the Redcat 51. What is not to like about it? Well, what is not to like about it is first this statement here: the f3.5 aperture lets in twice as much light as an f5 aperture. That is extremely misleading, and I would say an outright lie. For the same aperture, you'll get the same amount of light in your optics. It just depends on how you make use of that light. The Minicat 51 basically puts more light onto a given surface area of your sensor for a certain amount of or unit of time than the Redcat 51 does. And this is simply because the Minicat 51 zooms in less. It has a shorter focal length. It does not in any way, shape or form let in twice as much light as its bigger brother with an almost f5 aperture, just to be clear. Okay, but that's an aside, because we see after clicking the read more button here, that there is, for perfectionists in astrophotography, we recommend using BXT software after stacking your images to achieve flawless correction of peripheral star points. We'll see, based on the spot diagrams, this is a bit of a spoiler, that this is true not only for the corners of the peripheral stars, but also to some extent for the stars at the center of the field of view. Okay, and there's something more. There's this disclaimer here, which is very interesting to have this section here. Due to the nature of Minicat's fast aperture optical design, edge stars may not be as round as with other Redcats. However, our tests show it still outperforms conventional lenses. For the best results, we recommend using aberration correction software like Blur Exterminator, BXT, which costs $100 and which can only be used with PixInsight, which itself costs $300. So if you don't already have that, it's something to really take into account. Okay, keeping reading. Peripheral distortions can be perfectly corrected on APS-C sensors, while full frame may need some fine-tuning for even better results. Okay, so what does that mean? They have some, as usual, their marketing website design is absolutely beautiful. Looking at this, I want to buy the telescope, even though I know I should not buy the telescope. And there is a spot diagram. We'll get back to that in a moment. And it's very interesting that at the very bottom, if you keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, finally, you get to some places where you have, correctable corner imperfections. And again, we have the same thing. Like the star edge stars may not be as round as with other Redcats. And in fact, center stars are just as round, but they will be larger than other Redcats. We'll see that in a moment. However, our tests show it still outperforms conventional lenses, whatever that means, with aberration correction software like Blur Exterminator. Yeah, well, okay. And indeed, if we look at the stars before process and after process, yeah, the stars before process, even in the center of the field of view, they look a bit fat and misshapen. And same, we have like these original and after process, which is in a way a good idea because we always process our pictures. So it makes sense to show the results of your telescope after we do the processing. I have nothing against that. And then we do get some original single shot corner grids. We can try to have a closer look there. This is on an APS-C size sensor. We can see the stars at the center, and we can definitely see that the stars on the sides of the image and the corner of the APS-C sensor, it's not a huge sensor, are definitely having some issues. But in a lot of cases, not the end of the world. It might be a little bit more of the end of the world once we look at the price of that telescope. It is $900 for a small refractor. That is expensive, and it's a small refractor that may not have the best optical correction ever. Okay, so with that in mind, of course, there's commentary to be had about like what is going on here. On the one side, William Optics is basically being extremely honest about the capabilities of their telescope. They're basically front-running the crowd of photographers who tend to be perfectionists and saying like, hey, calm down. Everything's fine. We're being super open with you. The star shapes are not as good as the Redcat, and here are what they look like. And then here is what you can get after processing, specifically with that paid high-performance AI-powered deconvolution tool called Blur Exterminator. So anyway, what is going to be very interesting is the diagram reports, these things here. So we can compare the Minicat 51 to something like the Redcat 51. So here's the Minicat, here's the Redcat. And if you were to look at those diagrams side by side and you look at the center of the field, but first, exactly what is a spot diagram and how does it work? How is it computed? So in a telescope design, you have an objective lens. This is actually a doublet objective lens for an 80mm telescope. And you might have some further correcting optics down the line. And what we do when we want to do a spot diagram is that we model these optical elements in some optical simulation software. So we'll put in, the exact angle of the surfaces, we'll put in the refractive index of the material that we are using for the glass, etc. And then in the software, we will be simulating light rays hitting our lenses and then, being refracted, whatever, until they reach the point of focus, the focal plane, and we'll see how those light rays look like at the focal plane. And this is purely geometrical, so it excludes any diffraction artifacts. It is just pure light ray tracings. And because we're doing a spot diagram, really what's going to happen for our telescopes is that we are going to consider spots of light that are at a distance of basically infinity, which is pretty much exactly what a star is from our point of view. If there were no atmosphere, that's what a star would be. So if a star is straight on axis, straight in front of the lens, we are pointing to it directly, or the spot we are pointing to it directly, what we can do is we can take light rays that are all parallel to one another, exactly 90 degrees to the lens, and see what they do when we take those light rays and then do a circle at the very edge of the lens, and then we can do another circle like slightly like within the lens, so we can keep going. It's always those parallel rays. Then we can draw rays that go more and more towards the center, and then a ray at the center, and then we see how all of those rays will converge onto our focal plane at the back of the lens where the sensor would be. And this is a pure simulation based on the optics. So this is really a best case scenario. And that gives us the information about how the star shape would look like at the very center of the field under ideal conditions. And once we want to also check like for outside of the center of the field, as we also have in the spot diagrams, we'll still use parallel light rays. But this time we're not pointing to the spot or the star directly. So we have parallel light rays coming at an angle, something like this. And then we can do the same thing with those parallel light rays coming at an angle on a circle across the aperture of the lens, and then diminishing circles until we get to the center, and then we draw the output where each of those light rays ends up on the focal plane, on the sensor. And then we repeat exactly that, but for multiple wavelengths, because each color of light is refracted slightly differently by our lenses. And therefore we want to see, where they will end up on the focal plane depending on the wavelength. That's what a spot diagram does, and it is very important to understand that it completely ignores diffraction effects. So how would it look like inside that particular type of software? So we have an example here where I'm simulating a single lens telescope, which would be like the simplest refractor you could ever make. It's basically a magnifying glass. And we have a series of parallel light rays that are at 90 degrees to our lens. We are looking at it from the side. It's as if we had cut the lens in half and we're looking at it from the side of the telescope. And we have those light rays coming from a very far away point or spot of light. They hit the lens and now they get focused onto a point here where I have set up my camera sensor. And because those light rays are at an incidence angle of basically 90 degrees, they're perpendicular to the lens as they hit it, they are focusing at the very center of the sensor. But because this is a single lens and it has its own issues, it doesn't focus the light rays perfectly. And we can see that looking at, ideally we would see like all of the light rays focusing exactly here. And we see most of the light energy is indeed focusing at the very center of the field of view here. But we have some light rays that end up outside of our central point. Ideally, we'd want our far away spot to become a perfect spot on our sensor. This is not the case here. We have a gradually diminishing amount of light that spreads away from the center of our star, and we can see it on this diagram. That is how it looks like. And I could add another light source that is at an angle of the first one, meaning we still have parallel light rays, but they are at a slight angle, as you can see. So this is from a star that is not at the center of the field of view. You can see most of the light rays still get focused exactly on the sensor, as expected for the second point. So we'd see a very concentrated point spot of light on our sensor, but at the same time, a lot of the light rays get concentrated on top of that point and even more at the bottom of that point, which means that we are getting a shape of a comet in this particular case with this particular design. And this is a very interesting kind of simulation. It is purely geometrical. Okay, so now we understand how this works. We can go back to the diagrams of the Minicat 51 and the Redcat 51. So effectively, because we are simulating faraway spot of lights across multiple wavelengths, we are doing the perfect simulation of a perfect star across the field of view. And what this means, basically the top left square will be the representation of the image of a perfect star at the very center of the field of view. Then we can see we have the second square here. It is now 6.48 millimeters away from the center of the field of view, and this is how your star would look like. And then at 10.8 millimeters away from the center of the field of view, we are getting a shape like this. And then at 15.3 millimeters away from the center of the field of view, or the center of the sensor really, we get this. And then 18.4 millimeters away from the center of the sensor, we get this. And then what is relevant for full frame, 21.6 millimeters away from the center of our sensor, which is basically the corner of a full frame sensor, we get this. And you can see that if we zoom in, there almost looks to be like rods in there, and those are not rods. We can see it maybe a bit more or a bit better here. There are actually little crosses because each cross represents the simulation of a point of light hitting the sensor. And you can see the shape of those points is on the top right in the legend. And these numbers here, 0.436, 0.497, etc., those are the wavelength in micrometers that we are considering. So you can see we have the blue wavelengths at around 436 nanometer here, then slightly more towards the green at around 497. This is actually blue-green, 497 nanometers, then 546 nanometers. And now in the complete red, we're getting this yellow legend of 620 nanometers, and then deep red, 680 nanometers, which would be very close to sulfur 2 wavelengths. And so the magenta there is actually the deep red that you see on the diagram, whereas the red is more the center of the visible spectrum. You'll also notice at the very center of this diagram, there's this little dark, tiny circle. This is actually the airy disk. And basically, if your spot diagram shows that all of the light rays end up within that airy disk, it means that the optics are diffraction limited. Now we get into diffraction artifacts that are not taken into account by the light ray tracing that we are doing, which is purely geometrical. What this means is that if ever you try to compare two sets of optics using a spot diagram, but both of them, all of the light rays end up being within the airy disk, within this diffraction limit, you can't really compare them anymore, because now we are in the domain of diffraction artifacts that are not modeled in this particular diagram. In this case, very obviously, the Minicat is not diffraction limited at all, because most of the points are actually outside of the airy disk, meaning we can actually take this almost as gospel into how the star shapes should look like on our sensor, depending on the distance from the center of our sensor to the corner of the sensor. And now let's have a quick look at the Redcat 51 diagram, and we can see it is fairly similar, although we have like the same legend for the same wavelength, but we do not see the airy disk. We don't see where diffraction comes in. But fear not, there's a fairly simple way to compute it. You just do 1.22 multiplied by your focal length. So for the Redcat, this would be 250, multiplied by the wavelength. So the wavelength, we would need to express it in millimeters, ideally. So this would be, let's say an average wavelength would be around 550 nanometers. So that would be 0.00055. Yes, and now we take all of that and we divide it by the aperture of the telescope, which is 51 millimeters. And we get this result, and this is in millimeters. So what we get is that the airy disk for the Redcat 51 is roughly 3.3 micrometers. And it so happens that you can see the scale of this diagram for the Redcat 51. It's 100 micrometers for all of those 10 squares that we have on the side. So one little square has a side of 10 micrometers, which means that the Redcat 51, just like the Minicat 51, is not diffraction limited, and therefore we can compare those two spot diagrams one to the other. And if you were to like cycle between the two, like I am doing right now, it would appear that the stars in the Redcat 51, which is this one, are larger than the stars in the Minicat 51. So at first glance, if we're not looking at the details, it looks like the Redcat 51 is performing slightly worse than the Minicat 51. But remember how I looked at this unit here, 100 micrometers for those 10 squares? On the diagram for the Minicat, 10 squares is 200 micrometers. So each tiny square here is actually a side of 20 micrometers, which means that actually this blob here at the center for the Minicat 51 is actually much larger, almost twice as large as the blob in the center for the Redcat 51. So the Minicat 51 is definitely almost twice less sharp in a way at the center compared to the Redcat 51. And we can see that the star shapes or the spot shapes that we would get on the center sensor for the Redcat 51 across pretty much all of the distances, they are within, I would say, a circle of a radius of 10 micrometers. Whereas for the Minicat 51, we get almost to the edge of a circle of radius 20 micrometers. So there's definitely a big difference between the two, with the Redcat 51, like, winning hands down. Another thing that I like with the Redcat 51 is that the star shapes tend to be rounder. We have some oblongness here and there as well, but it's still more compact and rounder than something like the Minicat 51, where actually at those distances they kind of look okay, although I would expect some cometish type of stars. And remember, we're looking at basically twice the distances as the Redcat 51, and then really when you get to full frame, it gets really very ugly there, with a very large, basically a streak of light, effectively, instead of a point star. By the way, when you look at spot diagrams, sometimes some manufacturers, they'll put like a gigantic dark circle there to kind of give the impression that the optics are diffraction limited. This is pure marketing. The circle has no meaning. It is for you looking at the diagram to say like, oh wow, these optics are diffraction limited. Often BS. So remember, you can either check the airy disk radius at the bottom here, or you can compute it yourself. 1.22 multiplied by the wavelength, multiplied by the focal length, divided by the aperture, everything with the same units. Overall, it seems to me that the Minicat 51 page did not need to have that disclaimer. The spot diagram in and of itself speaks volumes if you know how to look at it. And so I encourage you, whenever you're buying a telescope or considering a telescope or comparing a telescope to another, if the spot diagram is published, have a look at it. If you see all of the points, all of the light rays are within the airy disk, then it's basically diffraction limited. You can't do much better than that. And if you try to compare two scopes based on their spot diagram and both of them are diffraction limited, well, the only thing you can compare is the size of the airy disk. So it's it's no longer really comparing the optics as much as comparing the specs of the telescope. But a lot of scopes, especially refractors out there, are not diffraction limited, and therefore we can compare them quite well using the spot diagrams. But remember, the spot diagrams are ideal points of light at infinity and drawn geometrically based on a simulation. They're not, we don't have like test benches where the optics are tested and then pictures are taken of the actual result. Would be actually awesome to have that for all our telescopes, but we don't have that. And there actually have been reviews already of the Redcat 51, or the Minicat 51, sorry, on sites like Cloudy Night. Some people have said they had issues with even the 533 sensors, which is quite small. And then we have some examples of star shapes across the field, with like the star shapes in the corner. I believe this is probably APS-C size sensor, or it should be, at least based on the spot diagram. And we can see, as expected, the comet-ish type of stars. I found actually another post with someone using the Minicat 51 with a full frame sensor and giving us some star shapes at the very edge of the sensor. And it looks like this, which obviously would benefit from something like Blur Exterminator. But it is, not as bad as I would expect. I mean, it's not great, but it's kind of like exactly as predicted by the spot diagram. So I'm not shocked. Although I'd like to remind you that if you have any comments on the spot diagrams and the Minicat versus the Redcat versus other telescopes, let me know down in the comments. Start up the discussions. While you're there, please leave a like on the video. It really helps the channel out. And if you want to help even more and you're planning on buying anything from Agena, High Point Scientific, even Amazon for that matter, if you do so after clicking the links that I have down in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. And of course, I'll have the links to the Redcat, to the Minicat, and to alternatives that I'll be presenting later in this video. If you want to sponsor the channel more directly, because yes, this video is sponsored by my Patreon supporters and by my channel members. So if you want to sponsor the channel, you can join my Patreon. The link is down in the description, or you can join the channel as a member. Some of my Patreon ranks have access to my videos early and without ads. And you guys, you know it, you make the difference. You make this channel possible. Thank you so much for your support. So with that, we know what to expect from the Minicat 51 with this price of $900 US. And I think it's a bit expensive for what it is, I personally would just go for the Redcat 51 instead. Or if you're really wanting a very small, very portable wide field rig, I would suggest to look at other things. One of the most popular options there is the Rockinon 135mm f2 lens. It's also known as the Samyang 135mm f2 lens. This is a lens that is widely popular in astrophotography, and it also has an internal focus mechanism like the Minicat does. It has a lower focal length, but not so far. The Minicat is 180 something focal length. This is 135, and it has a much faster focal ratio. And actually, this lens, it's extremely reputed in astrophotography. There are some lemons in there, so you have to play the lottery a little bit, but then so do you with any telescope, effectively. And most of the time, when close to f2.8, you get absolutely amazing images. And obviously, new, it is much cheaper, but because this is such a popular lens, in general, it's a general purpose lens, you can find it for really cheap secondhand quite a lot. When I had it, I used it with the Canon mount, which is what I recommend, and then you have a back focus distance of 44mm. That's the main drawback of this lens. It is a very limited back focus distance, but you do have adapters that are made specifically to work with Canon lenses with the right back focus distance, together with even something like an electronic filter wheel or a filter drawer like this ZW adapter for it. You also have adapters to put in a focuser on it, to have like this finder shoe on the top, to have it held by rings, and you can put a dovetail plate on it. You have ways to make that lens really amazing for astrophotography. And even adding up all of those accessories, let's say you spent like $200 in astrophotography, you're still much cheaper off than the Minicat 51. Another thing that you can be looking at as an alternative, potential alternative to the Minicat 51 is something like this one, the ASCAR FMA 180 Pro. And this one has a lower aperture of only 40mm, but it has basically the same focal length. So it is f4.5 instead of f3.5. So that's pretty large difference. But then there's also a large difference in price. You're at $400 US, which is obviously very different. And it's not a Petzval design, so you need 55mm of back focus, which is still very standard. Much cheaper. You do have accessories like something like this to add an autofocuser to that tiny little telescope. And if you look at the spot diagram, if you look at the scale, we have only 10 micrometers per square, and this is something that is basically on the level of the Redcat 51 rather than the Minicat 51. Obviously, this is again spot diagrams. They're simulations of light rays, and therefore they are showing you the very best case scenario. But I will put links to those alternatives and to the Minicat 51 if you're interested down in the video description. With that, what are your thoughts about this Minicat 51 and the disclaimer that William Optics put in there? I really like that they put this disclaimer. I think it's still like a telescope that is somewhat overpriced for what it is, especially when you look at some of the available alternatives, but it still has its niche. And I'm glad that William Optics is being so open about like the star shapes. And either someone complained, maybe a reviewer told them about this, or they just, looked at the star shapes. They know there's a lot of pixel peepers in the hobby, and therefore they just like front run all of the criticism and said like, okay, the star shapes are not as good as the normal Redcat. You will need to rely on Blur Exterminator to fix them. Every pixel peeper these days uses Blur Exterminator, therefore there is no problem. I think that's the logic, but I don't know. I like the honesty. Would I buy the Minicat 51? Probably not, although it is very, very sexy. I mean, come on. Look at the Minicat 51, compare it to the Rockinon, compare it to the ASCAR FMA. From a sexiness perspective, the Minicat is much better. Oh my gosh, do not ever take those comments out of context, please. Okay. And if you want to help support the channel, besides not taking my comments out of context, you can leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think of this Minicat 51. Would you want one? Would you buy one? Would you consider alternatives? Do you think it is overpriced? Do you like the way that they are being very open about this on their website? Let us know down in the comments. It's always fun to have some educated debates down there. While you're at it, take a moment to like the video. If you're new to the channel and you like astrophotography, you may consider subscribing. And if you want to support the channel even more at no cost to you and you're planning on buying anything from Agena, First Light Optics, High Point Scientific, etc., if you do so, after clicking the links down in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. If you want to sponsor the channel directly, you can become one of those members using the Patreon link that I have down in the description, or by joining the channel using the join button next to the subscribe button. I say it every time. You guys, you make the channel possible. Thank you so much for your support. With that, I hope this was a helpful video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, whenever you can, to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.